Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. As always, we start with today's big story. In the quiet hours of the night, deep inside occupied eastern Ukraine, the ground began to shake. But it wasn't an earthquake. It was something far more precise and far more devastating. A Russian military train packed with fuel, ammunition, and heavy armored vehicles was speeding toward the front line. For Moscow, it was another routine logistics run, part of the vast lifeline that kept Russia's war machine grinding forward. But then, just as the train reached a critical section of the rail route near Melitopol, everything changed. In an instant, a thunderous explosion ripped through the darkness. The sky lit up like daylight. Flames engulfed the train cars, and what followed next would send shockwaves through Russia's entire southern command. This was not an accident. It was the result of a meticulously planned Ukrainian sabotage operation that targeted one of the most vital Russian military supply arteries. And the aftermath? It didn't just stop a train. It shook the very foundations of Russia's military logistics in southern Ukraine. This is the story of how Ukraine destroyed a key Russian military rail route, and what happened next changed the dynamics of the war. To understand the magnitude of what happened, we have to start with the rails themselves. Since the full-scale invasion began in 2022, Russia's war machine has depended heavily on one thing above all else: railways. In fact, more than 90% of all Russian military logistics, tanks, ammunition, food, even troops, are moved by rail. It's an old Soviet habit. The Russian army has always been designed around rail transport. And as they occupied parts of eastern and southern Ukraine, from Donetsk and Luhansk to Zaporizhia and Kherson, they reactivated and reconnected the Soviet-era rail grid to feed their frontline units. Every train was like a lifeline, linking the massive supply depots deep inside Russia to the soldiers fighting near the front lines. One key stretch ran from Crimea through Melitopol, a city that has become a logistical nerve center for the entire southern front. Melitopol wasn't just another town. It was the bridge between Crimea and occupied Donbas, the central hub through which Russia could funnel reinforcements and supplies. Destroying that connection would mean cutting off Russian units in Kherson, Tokmak, and even Mariupol. It would be like slicing an artery, and that's exactly what Ukraine set out to do. But this wasn't a simple artillery strike or a drone attack. No, this was a deep, coordinated sabotage operation, months in the making. While the front lines raged with artillery duels and drone warfare, another battle was taking place far behind Russian lines, a shadow war. Ukraine's intelligence agencies, particularly the SBU, Security Service of Ukraine, and HUR, Military Intelligence Directorate, have spent years building a clandestine network of partisans and saboteurs across the occupied territories. These aren't soldiers in uniform. They're locals, engineers, railway workers, farmers, and former soldiers who stayed behind when Russian forces moved in. They blend in perfectly, living under occupation, but secretly feeding intel to Kyiv. Over time, they've become the eyes and ears of Ukraine's military in places where drones can't reach. And this particular operation, the one that destroyed the Russian military rail route, was born from their intelligence. For weeks, the SBU's counterintelligence wing had been tracking Russian rail activity through intercepted communications and satellite imagery. They identified a pattern, a heavily guarded military train that ran twice a week, carrying fuel and weapons from Crimea to the Zaporizhia front. That train was the target. The partisans on the ground mapped out every detail, the train's schedule, its exact route, even the timing of guard rotations. Then, using encrypted communication channels, they relayed that intel to Kyiv. Once the SBU had confirmation, they coordinated with Ukraine's Special Operations Forces to plan the strike. The goal was simple: destroy the train and make the rail route unusable for weeks. But in occupied territory, under the nose of Russian security forces, that's a deadly mission. One wrong move, and every member of the network would vanish overnight. It was just after midnight, the sky was clear, the air heavy with humidity. Russian troops stationed near Melitopol had no idea that only a few kilometers away, Ukrainian partisans were crawling through the darkness toward the tracks. They carried no heavy weapons, just small backpacks filled with explosive charges, military-grade C4, and detonators smuggled in over weeks through civilian supply routes. Each explosive was planted with surgical precision. They weren't aiming to just blow up one carriage. They were targeting the rail junction itself, a critical intersection that linked three key supply lines. Once the charges were set, the team withdrew to a safe distance and waited. Minutes later, the faint sound of a train echoed in the distance. The Russian military convoy had entered the kill zone. And then, with one radio command, the night erupted. The explosion was so powerful that it could be felt miles away. The front half of the train lifted off the tracks. Wagons filled with fuel burst into flames. Secondary explosions followed as the ammunition cars detonated one after another. For hours, the fire raged out of control. Russian emergency teams rushed in, but were ambushed by additional drone strikes from Ukrainian forces monitoring the site remotely. By dawn, the entire section of track was reduced to molten steel and burning debris. Satellite images later confirmed the devastation: dozens of destroyed train cars, scorched fields, and a collapsed railway bridge nearby. The Melitopol rail route, one of Russia's most important military lifelines, was completely destroyed. When the news reached Moscow, it caused panic. Russian state media initially called it an accidental fire. But satellite footage and intercepted communications told a different story. Ukraine had successfully executed one of its most effective sabotage operations of the year. The timing couldn't have been worse for Russia. At that exact moment, its forces were trying to reinforce defensive lines around Tokmak, a key stronghold on the southern front. With the Melitopol route destroyed, supply convoys had to be rerouted hundreds of kilometers through Crimea, adding delays, fuel costs, and exposure to Ukrainian drone attacks. Russian soldiers at the front began to feel the shortage almost immediately. Less artillery ammunition, fewer fuel deliveries, and longer rotation times. Meanwhile, pro-Russian channels on Telegram erupted with frustration. Soldiers complained openly about logistics chaos and empty depots. Ukraine's general staff called it a surgical strike on the arteries of occupation. Even Western intelligence agencies acknowledged the scale of the success. A British Defense Ministry report stated that the disruption of the Melitopol supply corridor has imposed significant operational strain on Russian logistics. But beyond the immediate tactical victory, there was a deeper impact: psychological warfare. The message was clear. Even in occupied territory, even in areas Russia thought were secure, Ukraine could strike anytime, anywhere. Within days, Russia launched a furious response. Security forces in Melitopol and surrounding regions began a brutal crackdown. Dozens of suspected collaborators were detained, homes were raided, checkpoints multiplied overnight. Russian FSB agents were flown in from Crimea to hunt down the saboteurs responsible. But the operation had been too clean. The partisans had vanished long before the explosion. They had melted back into the population, leaving no trace except for a scorched landscape. Moscow then turned to what it does best, propaganda. Russian TV claimed that foreign agents and NATO special forces were behind the blast, trying to downplay the scale of Ukraine's internal resistance. But the cracks were showing. For the first time in months, Russian rail logistics in southern Ukraine were completely paralyzed. Satellite data showed massive train backlogs in Crimea, and supply trains were forced to offload at alternate depots far from the front. To make things worse, Ukrainian drones struck again, this time targeting repair crews trying to fix the damaged rail lines. By the second week, Russian engineers admitted privately that it would take months to fully restore the Melitopol connection. And during that time, Ukraine exploited every opportunity. Artillery units intensified strikes on Russian fuel depots, command centers, and rail hubs. Each attack amplified the logistical strain. What began as one explosion had now become a domino effect, a chain reaction rippling through Russia's entire southern command. Here's the part most people miss. This wasn't just about one train or one route. It was part of Ukraine's larger strategic shift. By late 2024, Ukraine had realized that brute force offensives weren't enough. Russia's layered defenses, trenches, mines, and air superiority made direct assaults costly. So instead, Ukraine began focusing on what analysts now call the deep battle. It's a strategy aimed not at the front lines, but at the supply lines behind them, destroying railways, striking depots, cutting communications, all designed to make the Russian front collapse from within. And this approach is paying off. Every destroyed rail route, every sabotaged bridge, and every targeted convoy adds up. It's death by 1,000 cuts, and Russia's massive centralized logistics system is bleeding slowly. Even U.S. defense analysts at RAND and ISW have noted how Ukraine's sabotage operations are now a defining feature of the war's evolution. They're asymmetric, cost-effective, and deeply demoralizing to Russian forces. The Melitopol rail strike became a textbook example studied by Western military schools as a model of hybrid warfare, a mix of human intelligence, partisan activity, precision explosives, and psychological impact. But perhaps the most telling part of the story came weeks later as Russian repair crews struggled to rebuild the destroyed tracks. Another explosion hit, this time in Crimea along the Jonkoy rail corridor. It was as if Ukraine was saying, you rebuild it, we'll destroy it again. The pattern was unmistakable. Ukraine was turning Russia's greatest strength, its logistics, into its greatest vulnerability. Conclusion: the war of nerves. The destruction of the Russian military rail route near Melitopol wasn't just a tactical win, it was a signal that even in the heart of occupied territory, Russia is never safe, that the era of static front lines and predictable battles is fading, that in modern warfare, control isn't about territory, it's about tempo, reach, and precision. As the war grinds on, both sides are adapting, learning, and evolving. But Ukraine's message is loud and clear. The deeper Russia digs in, the deeper Ukraine will strike. And in a war where logistics means survival, one destroyed train can sometimes shift the balance more than 1,000 shells. What happened after the explosion wasn't just chaos, it was a glimpse into the future of modern warfare, where intelligence and sabotage can do what tanks and missiles cannot. The question now is simple. How many more such strikes can Russia absorb before its entire system begins to break? Only time and Ukraine's next move will tell. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.